close to the end of the book of Hosea. We're going to be in chapter 12 tonight. If you want to go ahead and open up your Bibles to Hosea chapter 12. Last week we looked at chapter 11, and one of the things that was so touching to me is the way that Hosea is expressing the way a father would express when he's challenged with having to discipline one of his children. You know, sometimes, when you're disciplining your children, they don't think that you love them anymore, that somehow they think that, you're just being, enforcer, you're being a brutal dictator. They just don't seem to see past this idea that what is happening to them is something that's necessary. And I know that, many times in the middle of disciplining my children, it was hard to say it because, one, I know they wouldn't understand it, but that it really was harder for me to discipline them and to see them suffer. But I knew I had to. Because if I didn't, one, they would believe that it's okay, that whatever their behavior was acceptable. But in that, he just really did open up a side of him that we don't see sometimes if we don't look at the prophets and the way that he expressed that term of endearment that he had for them. But now in chapter 12, he's going to continue to remind them of the indictment that he has against them and some of the problems that he's struggling with them and why it's happening to them. Too often, when a person's being, again, punished, and you try to explain to them, well, this is why it's happening. They don't listen. And it seems like that in this book is many times and many illustrations from trying to demonstrate through a righteous man marrying a prostitute and having these children that have a name reflecting of they're not my children, I'll give them no mercy, and I'll scatter them, Jezreel, to then coming back and forth. But the point is, justice has to happen. Mercy is there. It's not that God all of a sudden is going to suspend his mercy, but that justice has to happen in order to God to prove to us that he's righteous. If he allows it to happen and go without punishment, then God is not God. And it's also a way of showing that this indictment that he has against them is something that is real and legitimate. And so in this indictment, he starts out describing, and he uses terms again before. You probably, as you hear them, it's the same person speaking because the phraseology and the language is the same. Quite often, we can hear that in people's languages, or the way they speak and they're conversing with us. They'll have certain terms they'll always use, bless their heart, they can't help it. I had an aunt that used to always say that. And so every now and then I'd hear that, and I would think of that aunt because that's the phrase they always would use when certain things would happen. It wasn't a term of endearment, by the way. It was sarcastic. She would look at one of us that did something really dumb, and she'd kind of give us that look, and it was combined with everything, and she'd say, well, bless their heart, they couldn't help it. And it was like, no, they could help it. But you see, we knew. And that's what we see that's so beautiful, that no matter what prophet is speaking, we see these words as usage. And God never forgets to remind them of their heritage. And these names, Ephraim, Jacob, Israel, are constant little reminders of who they are and where they've come from. And he's already done that before. So in verse 1 of chapter 12, he starts out with this, and he uses the word Ephraim. Who was Ephraim? Ephraim is one of the two children that was Joseph's sons. Ephraim was the younger of the two. Manasseh was the older. And whenever Joseph went to have him blessed, remember what Jacob did? Joseph wanted Manasseh to be blessed because he's the oldest. But no, Jacob switched his hands and put him on the wrong kid. And Ephraim becomes blessed. And Jacob says to Ephraim, you are going to receive a double blessing. And they did. If you look at the places that they inherited, the land, you see all these things that were going on. And they were the tribe that people looked up to. They were kind of like that industrial city that's prospering and everything's going well during the good years, the righteous years. And they go, wow, man, I wish I was an Ephraimite. Look at them. And that's the way that they were looked at. But now they're not. But they're representing the 10 northern tribes. They have 10 the influence over the other 10 or the 9 that was around them. And so God holds them a special account. They had a double blessing, and now they're getting like a double curse because of that influence that should have been a blessing to all. They've actually become the curse to the other tribes. So when he refers to Israel, he's lumping in all the other tribes. When he says Ephraim, he's holding like one tribe a little more accountable. So what does he say? Because they were the leaders of everything that was going on. It was like the big brother. He did it, they all followed. And so he says, Ephraim feeds on the wind and pursues the east wind all day long. They multiply falsehood and violence. They make a covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. Now that is a phrase that is used. He used that before. He used it back in chapter 8, verse 7, when he says there, he says, indeed, they sow wind and they reap the whirlwind. You ever gone out in a whirlwind and tried to chase it? I remember as a little kid, we get a lot of them out here. We call them dust devils. And I remember, we would go out and chase those things and try to get in the middle of them. And they're gone. They're there and then they're just gone. There's nothing to them. You can kind of see them. You think they're kind of neat. But what do they really provide? A lot of dust on your furniture, right? They just kick up dust. They don't have anything. There's no substance to them. And that's what he says. Ephraim believes that what they're doing is prosperous. But in all actuality, you might as well just be chasing a whirlwind. And so this other part where he says the east wind, now if you were to say to us an east wind, now out here in New Mexico, that's different, isn't it? Now, if you've lived here long enough, like I have and a lot of you, if a wind comes from an east, that means something completely different. If the west wind, we get that all day long, don't we? We know what that brings, dust. If we get a south wind, we know we're going to get some moisture. We see a front changing. We get a north wind, we know what that brings. We're getting some moisture. An east wind, not so much. It doesn't really bring anything for us, but it usually would indicate a change in weather, possibly some moisture. Okay, so that's our winds. What did it mean to them? Well, to them, the east wind came from the desert. So it was like our west wind. We get a west wind, whoever really expects anything really good to come out of our west winds? Not really. Not really. We get a lot of dust and tumbleweeds and things blown around. It was their east winds. So he's saying, you guys know that when the wind blows from the east, you're getting hot, dry air. You get it from the west, for them, it was coming out the Mediterranean. It was bringing in some moisture. So that's what it means. To us and you and I, we read this and we go, okay, east wind. But it meant something to them. But they knew what it meant. So all day long, that's what they're going after, everything that they're doing. But they think, honestly, what they're doing is productive. And he's going to tie that in just a moment here. But then he says, they make a covenant with Assyria. This is the whirlwind. This is the worthlessness of what they're doing. They make a covenant with Assyria, and then they turn around and they're making a covenant with Egypt. And that doesn't go well for them. You don't have, it's like during the Cold War. We had countries that were either aligned with America or they were aligned with the Soviet Union. And you didn't get supplies from both of them. You didn't sit there and sign up with the Soviet Union and tell, the Soviet Union, hey, we'll be your ally, give us all this stuff, and then turn around with America and say, hey, you bring us stuff and you protect us too. No, it would not go well for a country. That's what they're trying to do. They're threatened. And very similar to the Cold War, where, there were some threats that were coming from either side that a country could get a little nervous about and go, you know what, let's strike a deal with this other country. That's what they're trying to do. But the problem is, this is a judgment coming to them from God. And instead of looking up, they're looking around. And they're trying to work themselves out. You see, because when you play with dust devils and you're reaping the wind, that's all you see. And you stop looking vertically and you just see horizontally. And they tried to strike a deal. They tried to strike a deal with Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king. At the same time, they were shipping olive oil, down to the Pharaoh of Egypt. That doesn't work out too good. In 2 Kings, we find that it was recorded in 2 Kings 17:4. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hosea was a traitor. Now, that's kind of an interesting phrase, isn't it? But as far as the king of Assyria was concerned, dude, you made a pact with me, and you're a traitor. So the king, 2 King, continues and says, he had sent envoys, so king of Egypt, and he had no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, and he had done so year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. This is really kind of what he's talking about is going to happen. You're striking these deals, and it's going to backfire, and you're still not going to understand what has happened. So verse 2, he says, the Lord has an indictment against Judah. Now he's looking south. Most of this message has been to the north, but he's reminding, it's kind of like a warning. You notice at the end of chapter 11, he brings up how Judah was still, walking in the ways of the Lord, but it was kind of a weak walk. It was, they were waffling. They're only about 100 years behind, but they're going to be wiped out and taken off into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. But he now has an indictment against Judah and will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. Now, this is where he's now going to come into this next part that is beautiful. Listen what he says here in 2. Jacob according to his ways. So I want you to think about Jacob. Just think of Jacob. And he's going to repay him according to his deeds. So now he's telling them, you need to return Israel. Who's Israel? Well, that's Jacob. Jacob is Israel. Remember, these are very significant names. He's not using them lightly. He's not just flipping them around, or like my mom used to do and call me different names, all my different brothers, and what are you talking about? No, he's very, very specific and brilliant in the way that he's tying in the meaning of the name at a different phase in his life. So he's saying Israel has to come back to the God of Jacob. So he starts out in verse 3, and he says, in the womb, who? This is Jacob. In the womb, he took his brother by the heel, and in his manhood, he strove with God. That fits, doesn't it? He started out, what was his name? Jacob. What does it mean? Heel grabber, deceiver, supplanter, one who trips up. That was the Jacob that started out. He was the one to receive the blessing. We see how that, his brother Esau comes in, and he sells out his birthright because he's hungry. And Jacob, yeah, okay, I tell you what, I'll give you some of the food. That created this animosity that built up and built up. Whenever Jacob's on his deathbed, we hear that, mom hears that he's going to bless Esau, and he's not going to bless Jacob the same. So this scheme comes about where Jacob goes in, pretends to be Esau, and receives the blessing. And then, of course, Esau has a lot more hate now because, 1, he sold his birthright, and then 2, now he's taken the blessing, which really is the same, by the way. Taking that final blessing was also a part of that birthright that he took. And then that sent him off fleeing. Now remember, on his journey, as he's fleeing by himself, going back to Amram, or Haram, where his family's from, that's where Abraham came from, he spends a lonely night with a rock as a pillow. And in that, he has a dream. In that dream, he sees the angels ascending and descending from heaven. Now, what's fascinating, and we don't have time to go through all of it, but just to kind of give you a feel for the character of this Jacob, he was not a spiritual boy. By this time, he's actually in his 50s or 60s, I think. He's not even a young man. But even in this dream, after all that he sees, he has this statement he makes to God that basically says, okay, I tell you what, if you bless me and everything happens, then you'll be my God. I mean, it really comes out that way. That's what he's kind of saying to God. That's the attitude that he had. Now, when he goes back and he works for his uncle Laban, and now his uncle, this must be a genetic trait. of trickery, right? Because we know that he worked 7 years, he ends up with the wrong wife, and he has to work another 7 years, and this treachery goes back and forth. Then all of a sudden we see that toward the end, then we see Jacob in this shifting of resources, right? Through the breeding of the goats and the sheep and stuff, and he ends up, and then he has to leave again, and he takes off. Father-in-law pursues him. Now, he's got something to deal with, too, on his way back, and that's his brother. But his father-in-law catches up to him. Why have you done this? Now, you can see both sides of it, but there is a lack of spirituality, honestly, that this man Jacob at this point has. And after that, then he prepares to meet his brother. And the way he does it, it's not that good either. He sets it up in phases and arranges from the least important group into 3 different groups. And each one of them, that as they encounter his brother, are supposed to say, the Lord, your servant Jacob, has given you these gifts. And if he kills them off, well, there's going to be a second group that comes along, and then they're to tell Esau this. And if they get wiped out, then, hopefully he'll get tired and he'll just take the gifts. But you see, it's not about him going in front and facing his brother and repenting and apologizing and dealing with his brother. No. He puts his family out in front, arranges them in such where they have to encounter Esau. Now, the night before he's going to have this encounter with his brother, he sets his family up on one side of the river, and he goes over and he gets away from them. He's by himself. That night is the incredible night that he fights with the angel of the Lord. Now, I think we miss another part. This is the Jacob that is not the spiritually minded man. This is the conniver, the supplanter. Even within his plan, like I just described to you, to try to reconcile with his brother, he's conniving to protect himself. Remember, he put the least important in front, most important in the back. Guess who's in the back? He is. He has this encounter with this man. Now, have you ever wondered what started that fight? What started that fight that night? I have no idea. I don't have the answer necessarily. But it wasn't a casual, hey, you want to wrestle? He's nearly 80 years old. He's not a young man. When I don't know how it started, but this was all night long. Now, I wrestled in the 9th grade, and I'll tell you what, we did 3-minute rounds, and I was done. I could not go on. So there's something about his stamina as well. But he's fighting with him. He's resisting with him. Now, whether he knows that this is God or not, if he knew it's God, he should have stopped, right? What are you doing fighting with God? But he starts out and he fights. And I think that is his attitude. That's his spirituality. That's who Jacob was to fight first and then settle it later. There was something about that fight that went on all night long. And it wasn't until in the morning that then finally the angel of the Lord touched his hip, dislocates it. And then he realizes. And then he's saying, well, who are you? And that's when he says, what's your name? The angel of the Lord says, what's your name? My name is supplanter, trickerer. And you see, this is something he goes on to say. Look what he says. Now, this is where Hosea really brings out. Now, this is God speaking, okay? Not just Hosea. This is God expressing the event of that night. Listen to what he says in verse 4. And he strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He wept and sought his favor. It took a tremendous struggle all night long. And it wasn't until in the morning that he finally changed. And it wasn't until, and we don't know how this happened or exactly, but we can see that something happened that caused him to finally change who he was and to change that. And then he sought his favor. He wept. Now, we don't have that recorded in Genesis as like this, that he wept. And I think when we see this, the inspired word, God saying, yes, there was something that converted his attitude and everything. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with us. Now, Bethel is house El God. Now, if you remember, one of the things that he has been using in the book of Hosea when he refers to Bethel, he doesn't call it Bethel. In the book of Hosea, he calls it Beth-aven, house vanity. It's no longer a house of God. That city had become a house of idol worship, and you see even Hosea calling Bethel house worthless, vanity. And so it's sad that the very place where God had first tried to encourage him when he slept and showed him this magnificent ladder and all of this, and then he wrestles with the Lord, when he comes back and he finally reconciles, where did he go? He goes to Bethel. He settles there at first when he comes back at Bethel. This is the God. This is what God is trying to get the people that Hosea is speaking to understand. He's saying, are the old Jacob. You're wrestling with God. You're wrestling with the whirlwind. But you need to be Israel. You need to be one who prevails, not fights against and rebels, but actually comes and accepts him. The Lord, in verse 5, the God of hosts, is the Lord, is his memorial name. So you, by the help of your God, return, hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God. This is another consistent message. We're going to go to the book of Micah, but over in Micah chapter 6, verse 8, he says the same thing. He says, he has told you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? That's what he expects. That is exactly the opposite of what they have done. So Israel, you can almost hear, and the same thing, like when I would be disciplining my children and my sons and I'd be talking to them, I already knew the excuses, the type of way that they would try to say that what I'm saying is not correct. It's not really the right story. They'd come and give some excuse for, no, I'm innocent. I'm not guilty. And this is what the Lord is going to bring out. It's like a one-way conversation. God already knows what you're going to try to use as an excuse. And so their false claim of innocence, he says in verse 7, he uses the illustration, a merchant in whose hands are false balances, he loves to oppress. That's what you do. What's a false balance? That means you're cheating. Something that should weigh a pound on your scales weighs half. So every time somebody puts a weight on there, it should be a pound. Now, you set the scales to where it's half. It's not exactly the way it should be when they would do business and stuff, when they'd weigh their wheat or whatever it was, their product. He said, that's what you're doing. Ephraim has said, but I am rich. I have found wealth for myself and all my labors. They cannot find in me iniquity or sin. That's the problem with the world. The world many times thinks, well, if we're prospering, then we must be doing something right. All right? That's the very first step to a downfall, is when people think that just because I'm prospering, then I must be obeying God, that I must be right with God. And that's exactly was their logic. He said, well, I'm doing well in my life. I've got good health. And that's what the problem was. The only reason they were prospering before this judgment starts to come upon them was because God had relented. And under Jehoshaphat, their king, he allowed them this prosperity and this moment of great security. And all of a sudden, they turned that and thinking, well, then we must not be sinning. We must be good. No. He says in verse 9, am the Lord your God. From the land of Egypt, I will again make you dwell in tents, as in the days of the appointed feast. That's the wanderings. I'm going to take away your permanent dwellings, the places where you have learned to be secure. It's the opposite again. Earlier I talked about, and he was showing how the reversal was going to happen. They were going to go, instead of the way they came from Egypt and came into the land of promise, into houses and vineyards and all of this, he's going to take them back out. And he uses this idea. He says Egypt, but he also says Assyria, referencing slavery because of the concept of Egypt to the Hebrew, but the location you're going to go. And so he's bringing this up again, this idea that I'm going to take you out just like it was, and you're going to live in these tents. You're going to lose everything that you have. He says in verses 10 and 11, he says, I have spoke to the prophets. It was I who multiplied visions through the prophets, gave parables. I've been talking to you. I've been telling you. You know, that's the same way. Today, God's word is the same word it was from the beginning. It has never changed. The Bible is the same Bible. It's saying the same message. The only way it gets changed is by us perverting it. And that's the problem, is that they were taking the prophet's words and changing it to what they wanted to hear or totally rejecting it. And it's the same problem. Today, we don't have God speaking to prophets directly to us, but we have God's prophetic word and all that he wants for us in the Bible itself. So we can do the same thing. God could say, I've been talking to you with my holy Bible through my word. All this time, you have been conversed with from me. Have you listened? Have you listened? If there is iniquity in Gilead, they shall surely come to nothing. In Gilead, they shall sacrifice bulls. Their altars also like stone heaps onto the furrows of the field. So now he's going to go and talk in the last part of this chapter about this same type of trip, again, talking about Jacob and dealing with the way that Jacob had gone off to Aram and Israel had come up out of Egypt. He's still kind of using these thoughts together. And then Ephraim, remember, was a tribe that was doubly blessed, is in trouble. So these are kind of the same concepts he keeps bringing up. Jacob fled to the land of Aram. There Israel served for a wife. You notice how he changes that? Because we know Jacob means the same in Israel. And for a wife, he guarded sheep. By a prophet, the Lord brought up Israel up from Egypt. And by a prophet, he was guarded. Who's that? That's Moses. Ephraim was given bitter provocation. So his Lord will leave his blood guilt on him and will repay him for his disgraceful deeds. Ephraim has given a provocation. He has been the one that's caused this. It's not God. And so because of that, this blood guilt is something that is associated with the sins in which they have incurred. And he says, I'm not going to just let them get away with it. He's already told him in chapter 11, that he loves them. But you're also, he's making him understand, you're not getting away with just, okay, I want you to just tell me you're sorry, I'm sorry. We're beyond that. We're beyond that. He's done everything that he can. That's chapter 12. We'll get to 13. We're getting close to the end of the book. But I hope that you're going and looking at it and reading it some more. Hosea is a beautiful book. Again, it's so important for us to listen to the prophets, go back and read them, because we catch these things like Jacob weeping the night that he wrestled with the Lord. We see this because God is the one now telling his story. He's the one expressing these words in there. So if you're with us tonight and there's something that we can do to help you in your relationship with him, I hope that you'll take this moment. Every moment that we still have to come to the Lord or make our lives right with the Lord is the most important moment. We may not have another chance, and it sounds gloom and doom, but it's the fact that we don't have but this moment now to make sure that we're right with God before he comes again. And he's going to come like a thief in the night. We don't know when it's going to happen, but if there's somebody here that we can help you this evening, I hope you'll let us know while we stand and sing the invitation song.